Let us pray. Lord, let the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be open to receive your love and healing. Amen. Whenever I travel, and especially on an airplane, I usually wear a coat and tie, or I dress nice. The first time I boarded an airplane was in 1968, and I was going with my father to Tampa, Florida. He was working on a job site there, and it was over Christmas break, and it was time for me to spend some time with him. And actually, I've put on a suit ever since then when I fly. I always like to dress nice. And I've kind of found, or I think I do, I think I get better service when I'm dressed nice. But I had something happen this summer that kind of changed my experience. And I want to share it with you this morning. Now, I've been fortunate. I've traveled a lot, especially with this Georgia Teacher of the Year thing. And I've been through airport customs many times. I always get nervous. I haven't done anything wrong, but I still get nervous. It's kind of like when you're driving along in your car and you see a policeman and you just hit the brakes. You're not speeding. It's just kind of habit. Okay, so you know where I'm coming from. So this summer, I was returning from overseas after an 8-hour flight, and I found myself in a very uncomfortable position. As I entered passport control, all of a sudden, I was confused. There was a crush of people. There were long lines. A security guard jokingly hollered out, "Welcome to the 8 p.m. crush," or the 8 p.m. rush, rather, and there was nothing rushing about it. We were all in very long, slow lines. Now, there was a long line of people, like I said, and the guards kept saying, "Keep moving, move forward." Well, we couldn't move forward because there were people in front of us, but they kept saying, move forward, very brusquely. And then there were people coming in behind us, and they were yelling for them to move down a hallway, and I could see it said, "Do not enter," and they weren't going in there, right? And they kept hollering for them to move down the hallway. And I was kind of getting angry. Why didn't they just walk down there and tell them? But anyway, it was loud. There was a lot going on. Another guard stopped the line I was in to let some of the airline crew pass through, and people behind me kept pushing me to move forward because the guards behind them were pushing them forward, and it was just a mess. Well, I finally got through to the passport control area, and now you scan your passport through a scanner. There's not like a live person there. And of course, my passport didn't scan, right? So I say, okay, well, what do I do? So I see it, somebody, and I go over and ask them, it didn't scan. And they said, well, they just pointed, go to this line. And I said, okay. So I went to that line and again waited and waited. And then they were going to open another line, and they held me and said, wait here, and you'll go to this line when she gets it open. And so I was kind of looking. Now, I'm tired, and all of a sudden, I hear the guard waving at me, or see her waving at me, and I didn't respond immediately, so people started yelling at me. It wasn't a good way to be. So finally, I complied. I got my bags. But I bring this up to tell you, I immediately wanted to complain. I wanted to say, hey, stop yelling. Go talk to him. And then it dawned on me. I could be branded a troublemaker. I could be pulled out of line. I could be searched. I could be put on a no-fly list. So I said nothing. And I endured the treatment. The harsh treatment. It didn't matter that I was well-dressed. It didn't matter that, yes, I was a white male, well-educated. My friends, that is when the bell rang. Or maybe put it in a biblical term, the cock crowed for me personally. Now, what upset me, and this stung too, that, many people are treated like this every day of their life. And I realized what it felt like, and I didn't like it. I was a well-dressed, nice, white guy, well-educated, and I was being treated like everyone else. Ouch. Now, let me make a disclaimer here before I go any further. I know this is a controversial subject. I know that, and I'm not blaming the TSA agents at the airport or the passport control folks. This is my own realization. The other disclaimer I want to make to all of you is this. I'm not saying this to make anybody feel bad or to feel guilty or to say you are not a nice person. This is my realization. I just want to share it with you. I'm a white guy, and I've benefited from something called white privilege. I grew up with it, and I never knew what it was. I'd heard about it, but until it was taken away from me during that 30 minutes at the Atlanta airport, I didn't know what it was, and my eyes were opened. And once the bell has rung, you can't unring it. So, what led me to this realization? I think I was upset, not necessarily how I was treated, but the realization that many people face this discrimination every day of their life. And it's troubling. Now, I teach at a high school. I love my job, but I teach at a high school that's 85% African American. And I've learned a lot from my students. I love my students. And one day in class, we were talking about civil rights, and I asked a question, and I'm going to ask you the same question. I asked my students this question. This is a question. Does anybody know the term driving while black? Anybody? Okay, a few. Okay, I asked my students this same question. And I will tell you, all the hands that shot up were my black and brown students. They knew what it was. The white kids had no idea. And I'm not blaming the white kids for this. I didn't know what it was before. So I called on one of my students and I said, please tell us, what does this mean? And he got up and started to tell a story about riding in his uncle's car. His uncle had just bought a brand new car. It still had the drive-out plates on it. And it was, I don't remember, it was a Mercedes or a Lexus. It was a nice car. And then all of a sudden they looked up and they were being pulled over by the police. Now, the student went on to explain that his uncle really talked to him and said, now listen, do not say anything no matter what happens. If you're asked a direct question, answer it and don't add anything else. Don't make any sudden movements. Keep your hands clear. But don't say a word. That's driving while black, getting pulled over. Now, the white students thought it was silly that they didn't believe that happened, but all of my other students of color said no, and they had stories too. In getting ready to talk about this, I was going over it with a friend of mine, and she said, we were taught about officer friendly. The policeman is your friend. But that's not necessarily so with children of color. This is an example of what I call white privilege. Or maybe a better way to say this is white advantage. Now, if you don't think this privilege exists, let me tell you another story. Back in the 90s, I was working for a legal publisher, and I was in San Juan, Puerto Rico on business, and I left my wallet in a cab. My fault. And the next day when I got up, I realized I have no ID, and I've got to fly back to Atlanta. So I was able to get some cash from a credit card that I'd already used to check into the hotel. So I had money, and I got in a cab and went to the airport in San Juan. I had my ticket, and I was able to talk my way onto a plane. Now, this was, again, over 20 years ago. We didn't have TSA, but I was able to talk my way onto a plane. I looked right. I was dressed nice. Now, when I got to Miami, it was a little bit tougher, but I was able to talk my way on the plane there, and I got back to Atlanta. Okay, now I ask you, could a person of color have done the same thing? I don't know. I began to ask around and talk to some of my other friends, and I will tell you, I will never know what it's like to be a person of color. I will not ever know what that's like. But I did start talking to friends. And my friend Robert reminded me of the time that he worked for the U.S. Public Health Service. He's a physician. He is Ivy League trained, went to Brown University, did his medical work at Johns Hopkins, and he was working at the CDC in Atlanta. Now, the U.S. Public Health Service, if you don't know this, is a uniform branch of government that deals with public health matters. This branch is headed by the U.S. Surgeon General, if you ever wondered what the Surgeon General did. And after the tragedy of 9/11, Robert was just one of a few epidemiologists that flew to both New York and Washington. Because if you'll remember, after 9/11, all air transportation was shut down, yet he flew. And what the scary thing is, and nobody really knew this at the time, and I got permission to say this, there was a real fear that there was either ricin or anthrax on those planes. And there was a fear that that had been put out into the atmosphere, and they actually were going to the hospitals to check admissions to see if there was anything that looked like it. Okay, so, pretty important guy. Now, Robert was born here in the U.S. He's a U.S. citizen, but his parents immigrated from Asia. Robert is a person of color. And when he traveled, it didn't matter if he had on his public health service uniform with his credentials and his ID. He always, and still to this day, is randomly stopped at airport checkpoints. I've never been randomly stopped. Could be white advantage, I don't know. I've spoken to others and I've gotten similar stories. People fearful to call the police to report something for fear of how they're going to be treated. I understand now why so many people of color tell their sons and daughters how to deal with the police. It's very scary. There's the Black Lives Matter movement, and it's often countered and attempted to be drowned out or watered down by an alternative group, All Lives Matter. Now, you and I both know all lives do matter. But Black Lives Matter is a movement in an attempt to draw attention to what's happening to people of color. Similar to what we're doing with the Orange Ribbon campaign. If you're not familiar with it, here at Asbury, if there has been a death by gun violence during the week, we will sound a chime and we'll put an orange ribbon out on our fence. And what we're trying to do is to draw attention to senseless gun violence. And I hate to say this, but I've also heard people in our community, not necessarily Asbury, but in Savannah, say, it's only black on black crime. Don't worry so much about it. I say that's the wrong attitude. To quote John Donne, no man is an island entire of itself. Every man or every woman is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a dirt clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less. Any man's death diminishes me because I'm involved in mankind. And then the famous line you've probably heard, therefore never sin to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. In the classic book about the history of psychology, and this was all new to me, and I've got a degree in psychology, it's titled Even the Rat Was White, goes on to explain that many of the early IQ tests were written, tested, and normalized without any input from persons of color. The non-inclusion of U.S. minority groups in the test norms was the rule. Whites supplied the standards by which all Americans were measured. Many were written without consideration of culture or cultural aspects. White advantage? Yeah, maybe. So why am I saying all this? Why do I ask, who is your neighbor? Our country is a very young democracy. Yes, just over 200 years, right? Wrong. How about just under 45 years? This was startling to me when I read this. Okay, I know the U.S. Constitution was ratified in 1787 and the Bill of Rights shortly thereafter. The 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendments came later and made enslaved persons free, granted the rights of citizenship, and finally gave the right to vote. But due to Jim Crow laws, many people of color were prevented from voting. Are we a true democracy if not everybody can vote? Our Constitution says all men were created equal, yet we did not assure that all people could vote until after the 1965 Voters' Rights Act was fully implemented. And you know, that took another 5 or 10 years. We are a young democracy. And now, with the new restrictions on voting, are we not moving backwards? Well, why am I saying all this? And I know this is controversial, but I'm a history teacher, and I'm a lawyer. Our country, folks, was built upon slavery. Now, you didn't do it and I didn't do it, but that is our heritage. First, we killed many Native Americans by disease and then later took their land. We broke treaty after treaty. That's what I was researching at the Smithsonian this summer. So we had this rich land, and what were we going to do with it? So we started importing slaves from Africa to work this rich land that led to a lot of wealth. Now, I'm going to claim it. I'm not very proud of this, but the land my family grew up on in East Tennessee was owned by the Cherokees. My ancestors owned slaves. My grandmother's grandfather owned slaves. And truth be told, and I am not proud of this, I am sure I had family members that were part of the Ku Klux Klan. I'm not proud of it, but to heal, I had to come to terms with this. If I'm going to heal my life, I have to make amends, I have to get peace, and I've got to move on. So, who's your neighbor? I say every man, woman, and child is your neighbor. I say the Muslim, the Jew, the fundamentalist Christian, and the pagan. It's the Buddhists, it's the Sikhs. We cannot use the name of religion to separate us anymore. To heal, like the Republic of Germany has done, if you remember, they were split into two after World War II, and they were reunified later. They came to terms with their past, and I'm talking about the Holocaust. They dealt with it. They talked about it. There are memorials all over the country of Germany now. And these are a new thing. We need to do the same thing. If not, we are never, ever going to be able to move forward. Okay, I'm a teacher. Something else I learned. How inclusive are our textbooks? This blew me away. 74% of children's books are written for white children. It's actually better to be an inanimate object like a truck rather than to be a minority child. 12.5% of children's stories are about inanimate objects. Stories about minority children are even less. I learned to read with Fun Time with Dick and Jane and their dog Spot. Okay? All white kids just like me. Another white advantage. Let's face it, most of history is taught from a Eurocentric worldview, and Europeans called this place the New World. But in reality, it was actually a very old world that had been occupied by thousands and thousands of years by indigenous people whom we called Indians. Let me back up a bit. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, right? Okay, we've heard that. What we didn't hear was that in 1493, Pope Alexander VI wrote a papal bull that became known as the Discovery Doctrine. This papal bull stated that any land not inhabited by Christians was available to be discovered, claimed, and exploited by Christian rulers, and declared that the Catholic faith and the Christian religion be exalted and be everywhere increased and spread, that the health of souls be cared for, and that the barbarous nations be overthrown and brought to faith itself. The Discovery Doctrine was the basis of all European claims in the Americas, as well as the foundation for the United States Western expansion, and I teach a unit on this known as Manifest Destiny. I will be teaching that unit radically different this year. Manifest Destiny basically says that it's our destiny or God's will that we take over all the land from sea to shining sea. The U.S. Supreme Court, in a case in 1823, Johnson versus McIntosh, which regarded Cherokee land in the state of Georgia, the court held the principle of discovery gave European nations an absolute right to the New World lands. In essence, American Indians had a right of occupancy, which could be abolished, and it was abolished. The statement went on to justify these actions as if the natives or savages, and I put that in quotes, were not properly using the land, it could be taken away from them under the doctrine of discovery. And they did. White Christian advantage? Again, the land in East Tennessee where my family worked and farmed once belonged to the Cherokees. The land that this church house sits on probably at one time belonged to the Yamacraws or the Creek Indians. The beaches where I vacationed as a child probably once belonged to the Seminole Indians, and it goes on. While the first slaves were native Indians, and once they were removed again, it ushered in the time of plantation slavery, and slavery expanded. We broke families apart, took away religions, beat people into submission, and then called them savages. This actually split the nation apart. We know about the Civil War. After the Civil War, we had a plan of Reconstruction, and it was working. But many whites lost their advantage. And then we had the election of 1877. There was a compromise reached. Reconstruction ended. And Jim Crow laws came back in. They were actually slave codes rewritten. And it was as if the 13th, 14th, and the 15th Amendments never took place. So who's your neighbor? Anyone who's hurting. Anyone who's being denied the ability to make a living. Anyone who has inadequate or proper education, or dare I say health care. No, we're all a part of the whole. Any death diminishes me and you. if we're a part of the whole. I heard an interview last week about the Brown decision, the Brown versus Board decision. That was what was ended public segregation in schools. When the schools were finally combined, closing the poorly funded black schools and busing children to white schools, what happened to the black teachers? I didn't know this, but most of them were fired. So when black students came to white schools, they never saw a black teacher. White teachers had never been around black kids, and there was a culture shock. And to this day, minority youth are the ones who are suspended most in our public schools. Maybe we should have sent the black teachers first and then brought the black children over. I don't know. I got mine, let them get theirs. It's only black on black crime. How does that impact me? It impacts me, and it impacts you. Because we are told, no, we are commanded to love God and our neighbor. No ifs, ands, or buts. If we're to heal our country, we need to talk about what has happened in the past so we can heal today. It was not you or me who did this. I know that. But it's a heritage that we have. But where in the world today we can change things? We can drop that legacy. We don't need it anymore. We don't need it anymore. Times have changed. But before we move on, we've got to heal. If we ignore it, it will never go away, and we will continue to be a divided country, a divided state, and a divided community. This is a lot to carry. This is a big burden to put on our children. Racism is taught. Let's heal and teach someone else how to heal. And again, you may not even know that you have this advantage. I want to close with a final story. And it's really not a story, but it was something that was told to me by a third grade teacher. And she was asking her students, what did they want other people to know about them? And this is what two of the children said. I don't want people to be afraid of me and lock their doors when I walk down the street. This is an 8-year-old. I'm a good person, and I want to be somebody important when I grow up. Do you hear that from other children? Probably not. Maybe we need to not be afraid to ask people about what they've experienced. My eyes were really opened. And it's not to fix it, because we can't fix it, but just to try to understand and give that person a voice. There's healing in just listening to stories. And again, remember, I didn't create white privilege, and neither did you. But together, we can see beyond what is holding us apart. And we can begin to heal. We can heal our souls, we can heal each other, and eventually our country. In the name of a risen Lord, God, love your neighbor as yourself, and upon these hang all the commandments. Amen and amen.